Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a scalpel to one of the most explosive, dynamic, and ultimately tragic periods in 20th century American history. We're looking at the final feverish 2 years of Malcolm X's life.
It's a period that is just defined by intellectual velocity, extreme violence, global transformation, and I think fundamental betrayal.
Absolutely. And the core event that really frames this whole tragedy, it happened on March 8, 1964.
Right. That's the day the man who had been the most articulate, powerful, and, visible public face of the Nation of Islam, the NOI, announced he was leaving.
Resigning from the movement he had spent a decade building into a national phenomenon.
And here's the core tension we're exploring today. The moment he walked away, a clock started ticking.
And this wasn't some quiet resignation, was it?
Not at all. Within weeks of that public departure, Malcolm X explicitly predicted that the very organization he had dedicated his life to, the Nation of Islam, would try to...
So our mission for this deep dive is to follow that turbulent path. We're going to trace the story of that violent split, the rapid global metamorphosis he underwent, and ultimately the political and ideological forces that orchestrated his death.
And to really understand the scope and the sheer velocity of that change, we first have to ground ourselves in the remarkable shifting identities this man inhabited.
It's like he lived 3 different lives.
In a way, he did. He was born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska on May 19th, 1925. He spent his early life just battered by the institutional violence of the American Midwest.
Then he becomes Malcolm X.
Exactly. He adopts that powerful, defiant symbol, Malcolm X, in the 1950s while serving the NOI. It was a name that just rejected the history assigned to him by his oppressors.
But it's that third identity, the one he adopted in the final year of his life, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. That's the real key here, isn't it?
It is. That name truly represents the revolutionary thinker who was cut down just as he began to define his own independent global vision.
So we're tracing the journey of a figure who transformed from a small-town Midwestern kid and a street hustler to a national icon and then to an international diplomat.
And to grasp the significance of that final transformation, you absolutely have to understand the why behind his break with the Nation of Islam.
A split that wasn't just philosophical.
No, it proved to be profoundly and fatally dangerous. To understand the velocity of that collapse in 1964, we first have to ground ourselves in the violence that forged. And that story starts not in the civil rights era, but in the crucible of his childhood in the 19th.
To really understand the man, you have to understand the specific hostile and volatile soil he grew in. We often focus on the 1950s and 60s as, the height of racial unrest.
Right.
But the America of the 1920s was defined by deep, raw, and explicit racial and ethnic tensions that often boiled over into open conflict. It was a time of immense internal stress in the United States.
Absolutely. The violence of that era wasn't just systemic. It was often spectacular, designed to terror.
And the level of hostility towards successful African-American communities is just. It's epitomized by the Tulsa Race Massacre, which happened over 2 days, May 31st and June 1st, 1921.
And this was a direct, devastating attack on the Greenwood District, which had become nationally renowned as Black Wall Street.
This wasn't just a neighborhood brawl either. This was targeted destruction based on visible affluence.
Oh, completely. I mean, we are talking about hundreds of people being killed, thousands of Black residents being arrested and detained, and over 30 square blocks of businesses and homes being systematically set alight and destroyed.
It really stands as one of the single worst incidents of intercommunal violence in U.S. history. And critically, this happened just 2 years after the devastating Red Summer of 1919.
The Red Summer was a nationwide spasm of violence. You saw race riots and hundreds of deaths in major cities, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and horrific massacres in rural areas, particularly in Arkansas.
So the takeaway for a child being born into this decade, like Malcolm Little in 1925, was that Black success was met not just with legal challenge, but with immediate deadly physical force.
Exactly. And it's vital to remember that the tensions weren't solely black-white, though that was certainly the most violent.
Right. The 1920s were characterized by this massive nativist push.
The Ku Klux Klan membership swelled enormously, reaching into the millions as white Protestant Americans desperately tried to cling to a perceived old order that they felt away.
And who were the target?
Well, they viewed the prosperity of African Americans in places like Tulsa or Atlanta as a threat, yes, but they also violently targeted the influx of Roman Catholic, Irish, and Italians, Jewish migrants fleeing pogrom in Europe. Really any group that disrupted the white Protestant.
So Malcolm Little was raised in this crucible where his very existence and the existence of his politically active family was seen as an existential threat by the dominant power structure.
Given that atmosphere of terror, it's no surprise his parents weren't politically passive.
Not at all. How deep was their involvement in Marcus Garvey's Black nationalist movement, the UNIA?
Their involvement was central to their lives and their geography. So Malcolm's parents, Earl Little, a skilled carpenter from Georgia, and Louise Langdon from Grenada.
Grenada in the Caribbean.
Right, a Caribbean island whose population had deep roots in Western Africa, likely the Nigeria region, due to the transatlantic slave trade. Both of them were highly committed to the UNIA, the Universal Negro.
And Marcus Garvey, who founded the UNIA, he was a Jamaican-born activist who advocated for Black economic self-sufficiency and this concept of Africa for the Africans, influencing everything from political movements to the emergence of Rastafarianism.
And Earl and Louise weren't just followers. Earl was a local UNIA organizer and preacher.
And that activism came at an immediate physical cost.
Oh, absolutely. Because of Earl's preaching and his organizational efforts, the family was constantly relocating across the Midwest, Nebraska, Milwaukee, Michigan, just searching for a community where they wouldn't be threatened. Earl's ability to find work as a carpenter provided short-term stability, but that fear followed them.
And we see that threat materialize violently in 1929 after they settled in Lansing, Michigan, and managed to buy a farmhouse. I understand Earl had reportedly overlooked a deed provision that specifically prohibited Black ownership.
The response was swift and horrifying. White neighbors immediately launched legal challenges. But before the court case could even be heard, just after dawn on November 8th, 1929, their house was blown up using a homemade explosive device.
And Malcolm was only 4.5 years old.
Can you imagine? He carried that memory, the sound of the blast, the sight of the destruction as a foundational scar. It was a direct act of domestic terrorism aimed at crushing Black and...
After surviving that bombing, stability remained elusive. Tragedy repeated itself just 2 years later in 1931.
It did. Earl Little was killed under mysterious circumstances in Lansing on September 8th. While he was out trying to collect money he was owed for some chickens.
And the official ruling was accidental death.
Right, claiming he was caught under a streetcar or tram, which left him horrifically injured. But Malcolm grew up with the absolute conviction that his father had been ambushed and murdered. And that belief was highly understandable given the region. He believed the culprits were the Black...
We can't just gloss over the Black Legion. What made them distinct from the general KKK?
The Black Legion, active in the Midwest between 25 and 37, especially in Michigan and Ohio. They weren't just another KKK chapter. They were a violent, highly secretive splinter group known for their paramilitary uniform, intense, localized terror.
So they were more like vigilant.
Exactly. They specifically targeted anyone, Black, Jewish, Catholic, or communist, they viewed as a threat to their perceived social order. Their methods were often assassination and bombing, which makes the belief that they targeted an outspoken UNIA activist like Earl Little tragically plausible.
With Earl gone, the fragmentation just began. Louise was suddenly a widow with 7 children at the absolute height of the Great Depression, trying to survive on meager welfare.
And her psychological state was already fragile from years of displacement and violence. It deteriorated severely after she became pregnant by another man in 1937, who then quickly abandoned.
The outcome was just utterly heartbreaking for the family.
It was. In 1939, Louise suffered a mental breakdown and was placed in an asylum. She wouldn't be released for nearly 25 years. The state welfare officers separated the children, and Malcolm was eventually sent into foster care.
And he ended up in the Ingham County Juvenile Home in Mason, Michigan.
Right, a predominantly white rural environment. A town he later noted was virtually devoid of Black. The instability of violence, displacement, and institutional fragmentation completely defined his earliest.
It's remarkable, really, given that harrowing upbringing, the house bombing, his father's death, his mother's institutionalization, and the racial isolation in Mason, that the young Malcolm Little still managed to excel academically.
It is. While living in Mason, he was highly articulate. He was elected class president in high school, and he was known for his political curiosity. He had a genuine path toward white-collar.
But that potential path hit a devastating ideological brick wall in the autumn of 1940. Malcolm had been visiting his half-sister, Ella Little, in Boston, getting a taste of big city Black life.
Right. So when he returned to Mason, a teacher asked him about his future goal, and he said he wanted to study law.
And the teacher, a man he respected, told him that aspiration was unrealistic for a Black Midwest.
Not because he lacked the intelligence, but because of his race and his location. And that comment, more than the poverty or the terror, that was the breaking point. It affirmed the hopelessness of trying to succeed within the white system.
The implication was crystal clear. The system had set boundaries that intellect and hard work just couldn't overcome. So why bother?
Exactly. In 1941, he dropped out of high school entirely and headed east to Boston to live with Ella. The planned educational path just dissolved almost instantly.
And that's because Ella, despite her outward success as this imposing department store floor manager, she was deeply compromised herself.
Oh, very. She spent her days managing staff and spotting shoplifters, but she was a successful, organized criminal herself, engaging in these elaborate shoplifts. She was arrested 21 times over 2 decades, though rarely convicted. This was the complex, contradictory role model Malcolm moved in with at age 15.
That contradiction seems to have given Malcolm permission for a rapid descent. He started picking up petty crime.
And crucially, he started drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana vices he'd completely avoided while living in the highly restrictive religious environment of his childhood. The change was so swift that even Ella grew concerned about his slide into outright criminality by the end of 1941.
And that concern only accelerated his departure.
It did. Early in 1942, still shy of his 17th birthday, he moved south to Harlem, a place that just embodied danger and opportunity. He adapted quickly, adopting the persona of Detroit Red and showing a truly precocious ability to thrive in a complex, illicit environment.
He got involved in the numbers game, the illegal lottery.
Right, working the margins of legitimacy. His criminal life ramped up sharp. By 1943, he was deeply involved in racketeering, illegal gambling operations, and dealing narcotics, cocaine, and marijuana were rumored. There was also the unproven but persistent rumor that he worked as a male prostitute.
He was also dating B. Karagulian, an older white dancer of our descent.
And this is where we see that shrewd, strategic thinking that the FBI would later note. When WWII mobilization came calling, he managed to avoid military.
How did he manage that?
He didn't just pretend to be sick, he weaponized his radical ideology. He told the draft officer he was psychologically disturbed and disposed toward racial violence, successfully convincing the military threat rather than an ask. He evaded the war, but he couldn't evade the law forever.
His luck ran out after he returned to Boston in 1945, part of a small gang robbing watch.
Yeah, he was arrested in January 1946 after a moment of just stunning hubris. He returned to a repair shop to collect a stolen watch he'd left there, and he was carrying a loaded firearm.
He tried to cut a deal, didn't he?
He did. He informed on accomplices in exchange for a promise to drop the firearm charge, a promise the police immediately broke. He was convicted for multiple offenses and sentenced to 3 concurrent 6 to 8 year sentences.
And he later stated that he felt the sentence was unduly harsh, partly because the police learned his girlfriend, Bia Karagulian, was white.
Right. Making his conviction partly a judgment on interracial transgression. That perceived unfairness must have cemented his deep-seated antagonism toward the white American legal system, just as he was locked away.
His first stop was Charlestown State Prison, which is a truly Dickensian facility, built under Thomas Jefferson, infected with vermin, prisoners using buckets for waste.
His psychological state was recorded as moody and fatalistic. He was lost.
But the environment changed significantly in 1948 when he was moved to the Norfolk prison colony.
A much more modern, progressive facility that emphasized rehabilitation and education. And this setting gave him the space and the resources to commit to turning his life around. He began reading extensively, meticulously copying out words from the dictionary, educating himself on history and philosophy.
And at the same time, his siblings started writing to him about the Nation of Islam.
A black nationalist movement founded in 1930 that looked to Islam as a unifying, spiritual, and moral force for black Americans.
And this is the moment Malcolm Little ceased to exist.
It is. He joined the NOI in the late 1940s and immediately adopted the name Malcolm X. And this was not merely a name change, it was a profound, radical political statement.
The core NOI belief was that English surname, Little, Smith, Johnson, were slave names. They were the brands imposed by slave owners, stripping black Americans of their true ancestral heritage.
Exactly. The X, therefore, was a declaration of identity erasure. It symbolized the unknown, stolen name, a total, absolute break from the history assigned to them by their former oppressors. Only after years of intense dedication could a follower adopt a formal Islamic name granted by Elijah Muhammad.
So by the start of the 1950s, the transformation was complete. The street hustler was replaced by the disciplined ideologue Malcolm X.
Paroled in August 1952, after serving 6.5 years, Malcolm X was completely and fervently committed to the Nation of Islam and its leader, Elijah Muhammad.
His first act as a free man was to travel to Chicago to meet Muhammad.
Right. And before we move on to his political rise, we absolutely need to dive into the unique nature of NOI theology because it defines his early rhetoric. This was not standard Sunni or Shia Islam. It was a highly heterodox sect.
The NOI believed their founder, Wallace Fard Muhammad, who had disappeared in 1934, was a representative of Allah on earth. They rejected most traditional caliphs and imams.
And the truly essential insight here, which fueled Malcolm's early power structure critique, was the NOI's specific racialized creation myth. Central to their theology was the concept of the original man, the Asiatic black man, who was divine and the first inhabitant of Earth.
And the explanation for white people?
That's where the term white devils originate. The myth stated that a black scientist named Yaqub, 6,000 years ago, performed a genetic experiment. Through a selective breeding process, he gradually filtered out the black genetic traits, creating a pale, weak, and ultimately wicked race.
So Yaqub's people were the white race, inherently deceitful and temperate.
And destined for destruction by Allah. That is a critical detail. This wasn't merely generic racial hatred. It was a deeply ingrained, theologically justified structure that explained white supremacy as a temporary deviation from divine order. This gave Malcolm's rhetoric enormous power and certainty.
And Malcolm X became the engine and the chief evangelist for this distinct movement.
He was an incredibly effective magnetic recruit. He didn't just preach, he organized. He traveled constantly between Chicago, Detroit, Boston, New York, not just expanding existing temples, but establishing new ones in places like Hartford, Connecticut, and Atlanta, Georgia.
His physical presence, 6'3", sharp suit, combined with his impressive, disciplined oratorical ability, made him.
Well, when he was released in 1952, the NOI had maybe a few thousand members. By the end of the 1950s, largely thanks to Malcolm's organizational zeal, estimates suggest membership swelled to around 35,000, maybe as high as 3,000. He wasn't just a speaker, he was the primary catalyst.
And this growing prominence was violently brought onto the national radar in the spring of 1957. This was the moment he shifted from being known just within NOI's circle to becoming a figure the police and national media had to erect.
We're talking about the Hinton controversy in Harlem on April 26, 1997.
Right. Several NOI members intervened when they saw two police officers beating a black man named Reese Poe on 125th Street. In the ensuing fight, one Nation member, Johnson Hinton, was badly beaten by the police, suffering a serious head injury.
And word reached Malcolm X quickly. He mobilized his followers immediately, instructing them to converge on the 28th Precinct Police Station where Hinton was held. This is where the structural discipline of the NOI becomes evident.
They had an internal security force, the Fruit of Islam, or FOI.
Exactly. Known for their military precision and unquestioning obedience to orders from their ministers.
So he first negotiated medical attention for Hinton, but when Hinton was sent back to the station injured, Malcolm returned. As the night went on, the crowd outside the precinct grew to an estimated 4,000 protesters,
standing silent and disciplined. And that silence was the most terrifying element for the NYPD. A crowd of 4,000 people mobilized in hours by one man, standing in total, unnerving silence, demonstrated not chaos, but control.
And he successfully negotiated Hinton's second trip back to the hospital, where he survived. The NYPD was later forced to pay $70,000 in a legal settlement.
One police officer noted that Malcolm could basically direct thousands of people that night, almost as though a small army in Harlem was under his control. The national media covered this extensively, instantly casting Malcolm X as the public face of a new, potentially volatile black national.
A counterforce to the peaceful marches of the Southern civil rights.
From that point on, the NOI, with Malcolm articulating a militant political rhetoric. He moved beyond simply calling white people devils and began articulating a global vision, emphasizing strength in numbers for black.
He spoke of an African-Asia bloc of nations.
Right, comprised of newly independent black nations that were becoming economically and politically stronger. He saw the impending victory of black people over white oppression wide. This militant message attracted enormous crowds, particularly in northern industry.
In Detroit, he delivered a series of lectures at Temple No. 1, drawing upwards of 4,000 people.
And his warning was clear and specific, delivered with his characteristic prophetic intensity. If the black man's most degrading situation did not change, then the little man in the street will henceforth begin to take matters into his own hand. This was the sound of a movement signaling its willingness to abandon the established rules of negotiation.
Given that level of militancy and organization, it should surprise absolutely no one that the FBI was monitoring Malcolm X almost from the moment he left prison in 1952.
No, this was the peak of the Red Scare, and the NOI's anti-capitalist, separatist rhetoric made them immediate targets for surveillance, especially for suspected communists.
They kept him under tight surveillance throughout the 1950s. Informants were placed within the temples, wiretaps were utilized.
It was the era of COINTELPRO, and the FBI wasn't discriminating. They monitored King's movement, too, even with its non-incendiary language.
What's fascinating, and something we must linger on, is the FBI's own assessment of Malcolm. A report from late 1958 acknowledged his strong hatred for the racial hierarchy, but its conclusion seems almost counterintuitive.
Right. It determined that he was much too clever and intelligent for violence. And crucially, the report concluded that He is not likely to violate any ordinances or laws. He neither smokes nor drinks and is of high moral character.
This finding is truly incredible. Here's the agency tasked with monitoring the most potentially revolutionary figure in the country, and they determined he possessed high moral character and legal discipline.
So if the FBI assessed him as disciplined and nonviolent, why did surveillance intensify? Was this early assessment a failure?
Or did it demonstrate the power of his legal activism? I think it was precisely because he operated within the legal boundaries that he became so threatened.
Exactly. They couldn't charge him with sedition or law breaking. They could only monitor his thoughts and association. This high moral assessment, though, was likely based on the outward presentation of NOI members. No drinking, no smoking, sharp dress, clean living, which contrasted sharply with the criminal activity they were usually tracking in Harlem.
They saw discipline, and they translated that into a lack of immediate criminal threat.
Yeah.
What they missed was the political threat he posed to the entire social structure.
His notoriety was amplified immensely in 1959 when he appeared in the documentary The Hate That Hate Produced by journalists Louis Lomax Wallace.
Despite the documentary's loaded title, Malcolm's appearance increased his public profile immensely, making him a highly sought-after media commentator, a role he used brilliantly to criticize white America.
And he didn't just embrace domestic visibility, he craved the world stage. We see this play out most famously during Fidel Castro, the United States.
Right, Castro was the new leader of Cuba, considered a major enemy of the U.S., and he wasn't exactly welcome downtown in New York.
So Malcolm X stepped in with a brilliant diplomatic. He arranged for Castro and his entire entourage to stay at the historic Hotel Teresa in Harlem. This was political theater of the highest.
It forced a bizarre, inconvenient situation for global diplomacy.
It did. Major world leaders who wanted to meet with Castro, including Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, had to travel uptown into the heart of the Black community to hold their meeting. It established Malcolm as a key diplomatic facilitator operating entirely outside the established American government system.
A Black man mediating international relations on his own terms.
His worldview truly expanded exponentially during his first major overseas tour in 19. Elijah Muhammad, who had been invited as a guest of President Nasser of Egypt, chose to send Malcolm as his representative instead, which further cemented Malcolm's rise.
The trip was eventful from the start.
Oh yeah. After struggling with passport delays, he finally arrived in Cairo on July. He was immediately struck by a severe bout of dysentery and was effectively quarantined in the capital for nearly 2. But even confined to a hotel room, Egyptian politics came to visit.
Once he recovered, he embarked on a major diplomatic traveling to Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Nigeria, and Ghana, turning to the U.S. in January 1960.
And this trip wasn't just a vacation, it fundamentally changed his political calculus. He stopped viewing the African-American struggle solely as a domestic civil rights problem and started seeing it within a sweeping international context.
He recognized the connection between the subjugation of Black people in the U.S. and the colonial subjugation of African and Asian.
He wrote extensively, publishing articles in the Pittsburgh Courier stating unequivocally that Africa is the land of the future. We suddenly realize Africa is the new world. The world with the brightest future. He started connecting Black Americans to a global majority, not a domestic.
And he used this expanded perspective to launch a devastating critique of the Cold War dynamic.
He argued that the real global struggle was not the U.S. West versus the communist East, capitalism versus communism, but fundamentally between oppressors and oppressed worldwide, regardless of which flag.
This ties into his powerful critique of capitalism. He viewed capitalism not merely as an economic system, but as the historical engine that fostered the transatlantic slave trade and perpetually created power structures favoring white Westerners globally.
And this is why he strongly supported rapid decolonization in places like Algeria, which was then fighting a brutal war with France, and in Angola and Mozambique, where Portugal was desperately clinging to its colony. For him, the global Black struggle was synonymous with the end of imperialism.
As Malcolm X's profile grew through the early 1960s, he crystallized the alternative, aggressive approach to racial justice, standing in stark contrast to the mainstream civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King Jr.
Right, and this ideological clash became the defining conversation of the era.
Malcolm consistently framed his aggressive stance as necessary self-defense and self-determination. He argued that peaceful protest only worked if the oppressor had a conscience.
And American history had repeatedly shown a willingness to tolerate extreme violence against Black citizens. His own history, of course, reinforced this belief, from the probable murder of his father to the unfair judicial system that imprisoned him.
But he had compelling recent national evidence to back his position.
Absolutely. Think about the 1955 lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till in Mississippi, a horrific act committed simply for allegedly offending a white woman, and the subsequent acquittal of his killers by an all-white.
That acquittal demonstrated to millions that the legal system would not protect black lives.
So Malcolm argued King's philosophy of nonviolence took too nice a view of human nature, requiring black people to be perpetually sacrificial.
And King, conversely, believed Malcolm was overly militant and his rhetoric was counterproductive, alienating potential white allies needed for legislative change. Yet, despite this fundamental ideological disagreement, they had a kind of grudging mutual respect for each other's commitment.
It remains one of the great historical ironies that the two most defining voices in the American conversation on race only met once.
That single fleeting meeting occurred on March 26, 1964, in Washington, D.C. They were both there for a debate before the Senate concerning the landmark Civil Rights Act.
The timing is crucial. They met right as the central piece of civil rights legislation was being debated, with Malcolm providing the militant counterpoint that arguably helped push the bill forward. Otherwise, their ideological debate just played out indirectly in print, over the radio, and in public speeches.
We also have to address the monumental Muhammad Ali connection, as it highlights the emotional toll of the coming split.
Oh, absolutely. Cassius Clay Jr., the 1960 Olympic gold medalist and rising star, met Malcolm X in 1962 after attending an NOI meeting in Detroit, and the two became intensely close friends. Malcolm was a spiritual and political mentor.
But the tragedy of their friendship lay in its timing. Clay became the world heavyweight champion in February 1964, immediately achieving global fame. He announced his NOI membership in March 1964.
He initially took the name Cassius X, but Elijah Muhammad immediately granted him the high honor of the Islamic name Muhammad Ali.
And because Malcolm X was actively splitting from the nation at that exact time, having been silenced and then expelled, Ali was forced to make an impossible choice.
A choice between his spiritual teacher, Malcolm X, and the charismatic spiritual leader of the entire movement, Elijah Muhammad.
And Ali chose Muhammad, abruptly ending their friendship.
It was a devastating symbolic blow to Malcolm. However, Malcolm's influence was absolutely formative in Ali's political and racial awakening. It profoundly shaped his later internationalized views on race and African liberation. Ali carried forward long after he eventually split from the NOI himself later.
But this split wasn't sudden. The seeds of disillusionment were sown throughout the early 1960s, specifically around two issues: creeping violence and profound moral decay within the NOI leadership.
That's right. While Malcolm used militant language, the by any means necessary rhetoric, he had maintained strict discipline since his criminal day. He was deeply disturbed by what he saw in new NOI chapters, particularly on the West Coast.
Members began arming themselves and engaging in violent confrontations with police, like the Los Angeles incident in '92.
And Malcolm viewed this move towards spontaneous criminal violence not as coherent political action, but as dangerous, undisciplined behavior that would invite destruction. He believed political action should be not reckless.
But the deepest cut, the one that shattered his faith in the movement, was the moral and ethical hypocrisy of Elijah Muhammad himself.
The NOI ethics were incredibly strict, mandating strict monogamy, sharp discipline, and abstinence before marriage, essentially adopting certain elements of Christian morality.
But Malcolm, a devoted follower, began receiving unsettling information from trusted insiders.
He discovered that Muhammad, while married to Clara Muhammad, his wife since 1917, and mother of 8 legitimate children, was carrying on numerous affairs with young secretaries in Chicago. Sources suggest Muhammad fathered a dozen or more illegitimate children.
To Malcolm, this wasn't just a personal failing. It was a profound authoritarian betrayal.
The man he had devoted his life, the man he believed was a divine representative, was preaching a gospel of moral purity while violating every ethical standard the nation demanded of its ordinary members. This intellectual and spiritual disgust made the break inevitable.
All this disillusionment, the disgust over violence, and the betrayal of hypocrisy, it all came to a violent political head in November 1963 with the assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
Right, and this event provided Elijah Muhammad with the perfect political cover to silence Malcolm.
While Muhammad himself expressed public sorrow for Kennedy's killing, JFK had won some support among Black Americans and eased restrictions on NOI activities. Malcolm's response was characteristically radical.
On December 1st, just 9 days after the assassination, he publicly stated that Kennedy's death was an example of the chickens coming home.
This statement was deeply controversial. He later defended it as general commentary, arguing that America's deep history of political violence, particularly against Black people, had simply returned to plague the white political establishment.
But in a moment of national mourning, the comment was politically radioactive.
And this gave Elijah Muhammad the opportunity he needed. He seized on the public outcry to silence Malcolm, ordering 90 days of public silence, ostensibly to protect the NOI's public image.
And this was the final stage in their fractured relationship. In early January 1964, Knowing full well that Malcolm was dissatisfied with his moral conduct and his illegitimate children, Muhammad escalated the punishment.
He stripped Malcolm of all his positions, banned him from the temples, and formally expelled him from the movement.
The political utility of the chicken statement had served its purpose. It provided the rationale for neutralizing his most effective competitor.
The split immediately devolved into a bitter public war of words. Malcolm retaliated by confirming and publicizing the devastating details of Muhammad's affairs and secret children, justifying his need to expose the hypocrisy.
And Muhammad, in turn, cut off Malcolm's material support, the housing, the car, the financing that senior nation members relied on. Suddenly, Malcolm and his family were in a precarious financial state for the first time since he had been a street hustler.
It was in the midst of this intense turmoil, facing financial distress and fearing for his life from his former brothers, that Malcolm decided to reorient himself globally.
He converted to mainstream Sunni Islam, adopting the name El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, and immediately left for Arabia to undertake the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, in April 19.
And the trip was rife with challenges because of his history.
Oh, yeah. Saudi authorities initially questioned his legitimacy to undertake the Hajj, not primarily because of his American passport, but because of his prior affiliation with the NOI, which they viewed as a fringe, heterodox sect not recognized as true.
They needed to verify his sincere conversion to Orthodox Sunni principles.
Exactly. Once his identity was established and his conversion validated, he was provided with a private car for the journey and was able to participate fully in the rituals of the Hajj.
And this experience shattered the last remnants of the NOI's racist black separatist theology.
It did. He saw Muslims of all colors, white, black, Arab, Asian, praying together as one unified body. He wrote back to the U.S. that he had never witnessed such sincere hospitality and the overwhelming spirit of true brotherhood as is practiced by people of all colors.
After the Hajj, he continued his travels extensively through the Middle East and Africa, visiting Lebanon and Egypt, where he engaged with the Muslim Brotherhood.
He spent months cultivating political relationships with heads of state in places like Ghana and Nigeria. He returned to the U.S. with a clear, ambitious goal to establish two new rival movements.
One, the Muslim Mosque, Inc., rooted in traditional Sunniism, and the second, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which was secular black nationalist and intended to link the black American struggle to the broader international context of decolonization and human rights.
But the Nation of Islam had already moved past rhetoric. Malcolm was absolutely correct in believing his life.
Throughout 1964, prominent NOI members issued public statements that were barely veiled threats against him, justifying his coming death under the pretext of divine punishment for betrayal.
These weren't subtle warnings, they were explicit declarations. Just weeks after the split, in April 1964, Muhammad Speaks, the nation's official paper, printed a cartoon explicitly showing Malcolm X's dismembered rolling head.
Death threats were made to his family via phone in the summer of 1964 while he was abroad.
And the physical attacks began almost immediately after his expulsion. There appears to have been an unsuccessful attempt to place a car bomb in his vehicle as early as February 1964. By the winter of 64-65, he was certain his death was imminent, stating in interviews that he was a marked.
He traveled without notifying anyone of his location, changed his phone number frequently, and lived under constant tension.
And the threat finally materialized at his family home in the early hours of February 4, 1995, 1 week before his assassination. His house was firebombed.
Malcolm, his wife Betty, and their 4 daughters narrowly escaped with their lives. The fire department quickly ruled it arson. This act solidified for the American public that the internal NOI war had become deadly.
That certainty of death became a tragic reality 1 week later, on February 21, 1995, at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan.
Malcolm was preparing to address the Organization of Afro-American Unity rally, a security risk he was nonetheless determined to take.
As he began to speak, an assailant rushed the stage and fired a sawn-off shotgun into his chest. And this was not a solo act.
No, the shotgun blast was immediately followed by 2 accomplices firing semi-automatic handguns into his body. He sustained over 30 gunshot wounds and died shortly after being rushed to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. He was only 39 years old.
The scene was chaos, carefully orchestrated by the attackers. One element we now know was used was a smoke bomb diversion thrown just before the primary shotgun blast, intended to confuse the small security detail he had hired and the crowd.
Despite the chaos, one of the secondary gunmen was apprehended at the scene, Thomas Hagen, who also went by Talmadge X. Hare.
He was caught by members of Malcolm's security team and the police. Critically, the shotgun assassin and the other secondary shooter managed to escape in the ensuing.
The public reaction was immediate and immense. Malcolm's body was put on public display at the Unity Funeral Home in Harlem for 4 days, and tens of thousands of people visited to pay their respects, many viewing him as a martyr.
The funeral, held on February 27th, was so massive that loudspeakers were required to address the thousands who couldn't fit inside the cathedral.
The investigation proceeded rapidly. 2 other men were arrested and charged alongside Hare: Norman 3X Butler and Thomas 15X Johnson.
Right, who also went by Muhammad Abdulaziz and Khalil Is. All 3 were convicted on March 11, just over a year after the assassination, and sentenced to 20 years to life. The state argued the 3 men acted in coordination.
But the controversy surrounding the conviction started almost immediately and continues.
It does. Butler and Johnson maintained their innocence from the start, claiming they were framed by the NOI to protect the true killer.
And then in 1977 and 1978, the apprehended killer, Thomas Hagen, submitted sworn affidavits stating unequivocally that Butler and Johnson were not the men who carried out the assassination.
This confirmed the long-held suspicion that the NOI used patsies to take the fall. Hare identified 4 alternative conspirators from a New Jersey NOI temple, naming William Bradley as the primary shotgun assassin and Leon Davis as the 3rd shooter. He claimed the others were also involved, with one throwing that critical smoke bomb.
Hare's evidence was initially disbelieved or ignored by prosecutors in court. However, Butler and Johnson were eventually paroled in the 1980s.
And crucially, their convictions were formally vacated in 2021 by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office after a nearly 2-year investigation. Tragically, Thomas Johnson had passed away by it. Despite Hare's testimony naming the real conspirators and the vacated conviction, no new process have ever been successfully brought by.
We have to put his political work into context alongside his contemporary, Martin Luther King Jr. In terms of tangible legislative success, Malcolm's movement was nowhere near as successful as the more pacifist civil rights.
No, which secured the Civil Rights Act in July 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in August 1995.
However, there is a strong and compelling argument, often called the pressure valve theory, that Malcolm X contributed significantly, perhaps inadvertently, to the success of King's movement.
His militant approach created genuine institutional concern in Washington. The theory suggests that government and political leaders understood that if concessions were not made quickly to moderate activists like King, who still sought integration and operated within the system,
then the more aggressive, separatist, and armed side of the African American community, represented by Malcolm, would quickly garner greater support.
Exactly. The threat of Malcolm X made King's demands seem, in comparison, reasonable and urgent.
And his legacy isn't just political theory. It is profound cultural and ideological transformation. There is a direct, undeniable line between his ideology and the foundation of groups like the Black Panther Party.
Founded by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton in Oakland, California in 1960, Malcolm's call for armed self-defense and black self-determination became foundational to the concept of black power, shifting the ideological conversation away from integration and towards structural control of black community.
And the philosophical foundation he laid provided the raw material for later artistic movements as well.
Oh, definitely. His image, his voice, and his uncompromising rhetoric directly influenced 1980s and 90s hip-hop, notably Public Enemy, who sampled his speech and mirrored his call for radical self-awareness and He moved from political leader to cultural icon.
And finally, his enduring voice survived him in print, allowing his transformation to be understood by millions.
The autobiography of Malcolm X, which he worked on with Alex Haley through recorded interviews, was published in October 1995. It was a work he famously predicted he would not live. It became a canonical text, preserving the fire of his transformation even as the man silent.
It is a breathtaking history. The journey from Malcolm Little, the ambitious young man whose dreams were dismissed by his teacher, to the wayward youth sentenced partly for dating a white woman.
Through the disciplined ideologue, Malcolm X, who rejected the entire American system.
And finally to El-Haj Malik El-Chavez, the global figure embracing internationalism and traditional Islam. The transformation was immense, and the speed of it was terrifying.
It's the sheer force of his pressure on the American establishment that remains his unquantifiable success. By forcing the government to acknowledge the threat of more radical action, he undeniably helped accelerate the legislative response to the civil rights demand. He created a necessary.
But the question remains, what exactly was lost on that day in February 1965?
Well, considering the FBI's early assessment that he was too clever and intelligent to resort to lawless violence, and knowing that he was deeply disillusioned with the NOI's criminality and hypocrisy for his death, this raises an important question for you.
Had El-Haj Malik El-Shabazz survived the assassination and been allowed the time to build his new movement, rooted in traditional non-racist Islam and international law, leveraging the global diplomatic network he had already started building, what specific, non-violent political actions might he have taken to merge his aggressive rhetoric with actionable structural change?
What was the true potential of the man who died just as he replaced his dogmatic theology with a genuinely global, human rights-focused political framework? That is the deep dive that remains unfinished.